guys, I'm Ruby, and today's video is the final video in the 12 Rules for Life series. Today is Rule 12. So if you haven't seen the rest of the series, go back through the playlist and click on the Jordan Peterson playlist. I promise you, you will not regret it. So without further ado, I give to you Rule 12.
Rule 12 is pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. He starts off by ironically talking about his pet dog and jokes that the self-proclaimed cat people may be disappointed in hearing a story more fit for dog people. Now, he makes this joke as a way to bring to light the concept of minimal group identification. This concept was discovered by the social psychologist Henry Tajfel. His experiments were meant to categorize the participants into groups depending on how they did in the experiment and study how they acted towards each other. What he found was people tend to like and socialize with people within their own group, whereas they avoided and disliked the members of other groups. This happens because when members of a group cooperate with each other, it makes all the members of the group stronger. After all, there is power in numbers. We dislike members of other groups because of the spirit of competition that drives us towards personal growth and status. From here, he goes on to talk about all of the suffering that exists in life. This suffering is a common thread in all of the world's major religions. The Buddhists state it directly and say that life is suffering. The Christians symbolize this suffering with the image of the cross, and the Jewish stories of the Old Testament are packed full of stories of their people enduring suffering over the centuries. He tells the heartbreaking story of his daughter's struggles with severe polyarticular juvenile idiopathic arthritis, an excruciating progressive disease that affects the joints of young children and makes it impossible for them to have a normal childhood. There are few things that make it harder to accept our limited human existence and lack of control than watching your sick child suffer. What sort of God would make a world where such a thing could happen at all, much less to an innocent and happy child? The answer to this question is of the utmost importance to believer and non-believer alike. The great Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky addressed this issue in his famous novel, The Brothers Karamazov. In the book, the youngest brother Aloysia, who is a monk in training and of devout faith, asks his older brother Ivan, an intellectual atheist, whether he believes in God or not. Ivan responds with, "It is not God I don't accept. Understand this. I do not accept the world that he created, this world of God's, and cannot agree with it." He then goes on to tell a horrifying story of a little girl who was locked in a freezing outhouse overnight as punishment and froze to death before the morning, which is actually based off a true story that Dostoevsky read about in a newspaper. Ivan finishes up this terrible story with the following. Can you just see those two just snoozing away while their daughter was crying all night? And imagine this little child, unable to understand what was happening to her, beating her frozen little chest and crying meek little tears, begging gentle Jesus to get her out of that horrible place. Aloysia, if you were somehow promised that the world could finally have complete and total peace, but only on the condition that you tortured one little child to death, say that girl who was freezing in the outhouse, would you do it? Aloysia has no counter argument to Ivan's logic and admits that he wouldn't do it. Here, Peterson draws a parallel to dealing with patients in his clinical practice whose loved ones are dying of terminal cancer, and also his own struggles with his daughter's ailments. His patient asked, "Why me?" In an attempt to console them, He referred to an old Jewish story that starts with the following question. Imagine a being who is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. What does such a being lack? The answer, he says, is limitation. If you are everything, everywhere, and always, then there is nowhere you can go that you aren't already. Nothing to do that isn't already done. Without limitation, there is no story. Everything just is. It's this limitation that makes us human. To explain this further, he uses the example of the comic book hero Superman. In the early comics, Superman had significantly less powers. As time went on, he got stronger and more powerful until he became godlike. Then, something interesting happened. Superman comic sales plummeted. People lost interest. He was too powerful and had no limitations. It made for a bad story. Without our limitations, life would lose its luster and we would lose all the characteristics that make us who we are. In this sense, our limitations are necessary to live a fulfilling life. However, it's these same limitations that cause the suffering in our life. When we are plagued with problems or lose a loved one, we despise our limitations that prevent us from fixing everything and leaves us feeling powerless. If we can't find a way to accept our limitations, we will be left feeling angry and hateful. Taken to an extreme, we could lose all faith in what we believe a cruel world and lash out against it like the mass murderers we discussed in Rule 6. So how do we accept our limitations? Perhaps we can start by noticing that when we love and are loved, it's not despite our limitations, but rather because of our limitations. Now this sounds good, and it is easy enough to accept your limitations when life is going great, but what about when disaster strikes? Here he gives some practical advice he learned while contending with his daughter's illness. Firstly, set aside a time to talk and think about your problem, and do not think about it otherwise. If you do start to worry, remind yourself that you will think things through during the scheduled time. This will help with anxiety. When anxious, your brain is more worried about whether or not you have a plan rather than the details of the plan itself. If you let yourself constantly worry, you will become exhausted and burnt out. Next, you must shift the unit of time you use to frame your life. Things don't magically change overnight. Plan out the next month, then year, and even several years. Set your aim high and act accordingly to achieve that goal. Once your aim towards the future is set, you are free to focus on today. Put things you can control in order, repair what's in disorder, and make what is already good better. It's possible. Even through the trials and suffering that surely lie ahead, it is possible. But to persevere, you must see the good in being. If we lose that, then we are truly lost. So you may be asking yourself, what does any of this have to do with petting cats? He ties it all together by stressing the importance of finding joy in the little things in life. If a cat comes up to you and lets you pet it, even for a half a minute, it's a nice break. A little extra light on a good day, or a tiny respite in a bad day. If you pay attention, on a bad day, you may be fortunate enough to be confronted with small opportunities such as this. In these tiny moments, we can be present in the moment and appreciate the beauty of life, despite all of our human limitations and suffering. So, pet a cat when you encounter one on the street.